welcome to the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. The event will begin shortly. Thank you for joining us for this week's presentation. If you'd like to learn more about applying for the Rehabilitation Counseling Education Master's Program or the Rehabilitation and Addiction Counseling Master's Program at St. Cloud State University, please email rce@stcloudstate.edu. Applications are currently being accepted for the fall 2021 term. If you would like to watch the recorded version of this presentation or prior presentations, please visit our YouTube channel by searching for St. Cloud State University Rehabilitation Studies on YouTube.
Avery, can you hear me though? Okay, perfect. Should we spotlight Dr. Anderson? Well, I see everyone in gallery view, but I'm trying to figure out how to flip between the pictures here. Dr. Knopf is saying, Glenn, you can pin people. You can pin Xiaorong or Avery either, and it will zoom in on their picture and make them bigger. Good morning. Good morning. We're excited you're here. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have a special guest today, Dr. Glenn Anderson. Thank you for being here. So I don't know if you want to introduce yourself. And he's saying, well, this is my name in sign language, and showing his name in sign language. And Xiaorong is saying, this is my name in sign language as well. And my name is Xiaorong. It's Xiaonrong. I am from China. Yep. I have black hair, black glasses that are made of metal. I have a purple shirt on. And I'm always smiling. I always have a smile on my face. Dr. Anderson saying, I've noticed that already. I moved to America when I was 19 and started learning sign language at that point, and have been researching and studying since then. And I also am fluent in Chinese sign language, and my area of study is curriculum development. So thank you. We're so glad you're here. And Glenn has said, have you had a chance to go back home to China? And Xiaorong is saying, yes, I have. Oh, have you frozen here? Nope. Avery, do you want to introduce yourself as well? Hi, everyone. My name is Avery, and this is my name sign on my chest here. And Glenn is repeating the name sign and smiling. I started learning sign language 6 years ago. Thank you. And started learning to sign when I was in college for work, and have been doing so since then. I'm now in the graduate program for rehab counseling, and I am a student there. I have blonde hair. My hair is half pulled up in a ponytail. I have a black shirt on. It's a high turtleneck with long sleeves down to my wrists. She's saying, why don't we have you introduce yourself, Dr. Anderson? Good morning. My name is Glenn Anderson. My sign name is a G on my chin. I am wearing glasses. I have black hair. I'm wearing a black vest with a gray long sleeve shirt that's green. I also have a little beard that's also gray, just like my hair. Do we want to go ahead here? And Xiaorong saying, should I ask the first question? Okay. Were you born deaf, Dr. Anderson? How did you become deaf? Well, I was born hearing, which is a common occurrence for deaf people. And then I became sick with pneumonia when I was the age of 7. Well, and the reason I became deaf was they had given me a medication that they had used in the 50s that they had been trying out, was still in trials, and they had given me this medication for the fever from pneumonia. And doctors had let my parents know that there were some side effects and deafness was potentially one of the side effects of using that medication. So when I recovered from the pneumonia, it turned out that I had lost my hearing after that. So Xiaorong saying, what was that experience like for you? Can you talk a little bit about that? Sure, yeah. I mean, it was odd, to say the least. Before I was ill, I went to a hearing school with hearing children, a public school. And then when I lost my hearing and became deaf, I went back to that same school. But I didn't realize that I was deaf at that time. So I went back to school. I would walk down the hallways, teachers would be teaching, and there would be talking going on in classrooms, and I didn't realize what was going on, and I wasn't responding. So my parents had decided to move me to a different school, to a deaf program. But where I lived in Chicago, they weren't near or aware of any deaf schools. So at the school I went to, it was a public school, and they had hearing students on the first couple of floors and then a specific program for deaf students. But we were not allowed to socialize with the hearing students. And they hadn't really developed the idea of mainstreaming deaf students at that point. And there was about 75 deaf students in that program. And I stayed there all through elementary school up until 8th grade.
Oh, she's freezing.
Can you describe, or what the "you have to be twice as good as anyone else to be successful" means to you as a deaf person, that phrase? Well, looking at my parents' generation, during the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, Black people were leaving the South because of the presence of the KKK, as well as many other reasons. So it was not a good time for us to live in the South. So we had moved north. They had jobs there, they had better opportunities than there were available in the South. And my parents were not college educated. They were blue collar workers, if you will. My father was a janitor, and my mother was a cook in a restaurant. My father and mother wanted a better life for me than they had. And they always preached that to me. You need to go to college. Good enough is not acceptable. Good enough is not good enough. You need to be better than good enough. So looking at the people around you and thinking that being as good as they are is a successful way to live was not how they saw it. They thought I needed to be better. And they would preach this to me day in and day out growing up. And, we had a big family, and I had one sister, actually. And we were the first two in our family to have college degrees, actually. So I very much am grateful to my parents for pushing both of us along in that regard. Avery is saying, thank you for sharing that. Wow. Can you discuss a little bit about your experience being deaf, specifically in
Rehab counseling?
In the rehabilitation field, in rehab counseling? Sure. So, like I said, I grew up in Chicago. That was my home. And at that time, we had, actually, growing up, a VR counselor that would come to our home. And they would, they opened a case. And I didn't at the time really understand or realize that's what they were doing. And they would take notes and, consider the fact that I was deaf and ask questions. And then as time went on, I graduated high school and went to Gallaudet University. and they had VR supports and resources there at that time.
So they paid my college.
Which at the time they paid for my college, and my parents didn't have money for me to go to college. But after I graduated from Gallaudet, I had a plan to go back home to Chicago. So I stopped by their office and kind of introduced myself and said I'm in school, and would make my presence known there. At the same time, I noticed other clients, consumers, if you will, were coming frequently to get help with counseling or making calls for them or doing some of those pieces of the process, which I thought was beneficial. So I saw that, and that was very interesting to me, very fascinating. And I wanted to do the same. So I kind of put that in the back of my brain and thought potentially in the future, I would do something like that as a counselor. So as time went on, I, went through my years at Gallaudet. I was a junior. As a senior, I actually ended up graduating in psychology, and was walking down the hallway one day and had seen there was all these posters on the hallway. They would say, oh, future of going to school, or a future career, or working in different places. And they had all these kind of inspirational posters on the hallway. And it had mentioned financial support for graduate studies and counseling. And I saw that. And with that seed already planted in my brain from years past, I actually went to chat with the dean of students, who was deaf as well. And we had a really good rapport at that point. And I talked to him and I said, hey, you've got these posters in the hallway. I mean, can I apply for that? Can I go to the graduate school? And he encouraged me, and pulled out a drawer in his office, and he had every state's information in this file cabinet, in this file drawer. And he pulled one out, which was for Arkansas. He pulled out the little file and he said, oh, well, you could go there. And so I asked him some more questions. And then he had pulled out another one for San Francisco State. And the first one was actually not for Arkansas, it was for Arizona. So he pulled out 3 different applications, and I sent in 3 different applications and was accepted for each of them. But I hadn't been to Arizona, which was the first one. And so I decided to go with Arizona. And my mom at that point said, well, what are you going to do in Arizona? There's nothing there.
Just cactuses.
Just cactuses. And the University of Arizona at that time didn't realize that, well, they had a few deaf people in their PhD program, which I was pretty surprised by. And those individuals had looked at me as someone who could potentially do the same in the future. But I looked at that and thought, maybe I'll go to work as, get my graduate degree, my master's degree, but in the future, getting a PhD didn't seem fathomable at that point. But I still had kind of this seed planted in the back of my brain of what I had learned so far. And so I ended up moving to Arizona and working in VR there. But thought, if a job came up or a PhD program came up, later one came up in New York for New York University. Excuse me, I was living in Detroit at the time and had moved to New York University because they had a PhD program there. And ended up moving from Detroit to New York, and that's where I ended up doing my studies there. And as during, like I mentioned, as in high school, in college, I had services for VR, and didn't feel that I was pushed aside or looked down on as a deaf person. I felt like I was very supported by the counselors that I was meeting with.
Okay, I'll take over. Sorry, Avery, Avery, can you start over? Sorry, she was finishing one thought. I know you can't see us. Okay, thank you. Go ahead. Yeah, I just a little bit curious if you can share a great memory or a past experience that you have in working with the VR system, working as a voc rehab counselor. Glenn saying yes. So when I moved to, there was 2 other deaf people there, and they were not in VR. One worked for the state, I don't know, Detroit, Michigan. Thank you, Amy. And the other was a consultant for the state. They would drive around the state and Michigan and worked in Minnesota. And a lot of people would volunteer all around the state or work for the commission. And they could call deaf people to come in and network with them there. One worked for a Detroit water center, and they set up interpreting referrals there in that center. So I was like, okay, great. So the 3 of us are a speech and hearing center, and 3 of us became really good friends and working for the state, talking, working with the deaf center and those kinds of things. And then there was a person that worked for the state there and found a vehicle that they could take this training center, and it was a really fancy training center for different trainings for the students. It was like, oh wow, deaf people can do this, so we talked with them to get deaf people in to working at that training center. And we were the VR folks talking and partnering with these different centers for 36-week training where they could learn to be mechanics. At that time in the factories, nothing was automated or whatever. You just had to physically put everything on and hammer it in and use the welding equipment and so forth. So we chose, we chose 15 deaf folks. We interviewed them and selected a few deaf folks for the whole 36-week program. So they would come to the training. We would have interpreters in there. So they could learn to work at that mechanic, car center. And then we moved them they could get for job training, on the job training in different places. And the deaf people could learn there and learn how to do that work. And yeah, it was great because we saw a lot of deaf people getting all these different jobs. And before we would close their case, VR requires to go visit and see how they're doing and that they're doing everything wonderfully. And they said, oh, hey, come see this new car. So I would go and look, and they were like, oh, wow, that's a new car, better than mine that you got to work on and build. And excuse me. And it was very, very nice. So it was like really wonderful to see the clients really succeed and through the training program. And shortly after that, I ended up moving to New York after that experience. So that's one of my favorite memories, to look back on that, where the clients got a better car than me. And also they were really earning good salaries and good money. And were able to get training certificates at the end, so they could, be certified by the training center and move forward in life. Avery saying, that's awesome. And Xiaorong saying, well, thank you for explaining that. That's really cool. So I'm just wondering if there's any barriers for the VR clients before they became clients, or any kind of barriers that they faced. Glenn saying, oh yes, of course, that you faced. I mean, if I look back on things, there's really no interpreters at that time. Say what I'm like always like, what are these saying? What are you saying? There's no captions on TV at that time, and so I couldn't read. I was like missing. Go ahead.
People's parents didn't sign, and deaf people were getting told, I'll tell you later, I'll tell you later. And so people would bring, their cousin or their family or friend to come, and there would just be all of this conversation going on, and deaf individuals would be feeling left out.
Thank you. And there was no access to information because of that, like at Christmas time, or there's no internet. So there was no quick access like there is today. So I really wanted to learn about different famous people from the television, like baseball players or famous people, this kind of thing. Martin Luther King Jr. And just so happened that a group of us came here, went to the library, and was like, oh, I was able to borrow free books. And that really became my avenue of learning. Instead of trying to rely on the television, I learned to really read and get into books and learn by myself that way. It was like, seemed like I didn't know what deaf people could do, and I felt like we could do anything. And, but out in the regular hearing world, it didn't seem like people thought deaf people could achieve a high level, or go to college or anything. Maybe they just thought we could do shoe repair or cooking or house cleaning, those lower level jobs. But however, with the ADA, now there became the federal law that required, in 1993, that was passed, and the Rehab Act of 1973. And then we had the law behind us where we could go in and argue for access. And at my time, when I was growing up, there was no support for someone like myself who was deaf. It was like, if they wanted to discriminate, they could discriminate, and I couldn't do anything about it until the law was behind us. But of course, the barrier was having no law, no communication access, people's attitudes. Back then, wow, most people looked upon disability with pity, and just, people just wouldn't really change their mind at that time. And then Gallaudet University in 1988, of course, people don't still think that way today, but in 1988, there was the whole movement to get a deaf president in Gallaudet University. There just was really no deaf president prior to that. So the Deaf President Now movement was happening in 1988. And after that protest, and nowadays people, there's a deaf president, people realize, oh yeah, that's right, we should have a deaf president. And so since 1988, there has been a deaf president at Gallaudet. So our thinking and how we view the world is much, much different nowadays than it was in the past.
As well as just the view of disability and the view of deafness and what deaf people can do.
Thank you. Can you
Can you
I'm
explain what
missing
deaf
that.
gain means? Oh, hold on,
Deaf what?
we're gonna hold a second for the interpreter.
Oh, deaf gain. Okay, thanks, Amy. So can you explain what deaf gain means, please? Can you expand upon that? Deaf gain, couple of signs. Yeah, there's no perfect sign, of course, for that concept. It's more like deaf people spending time, you know, it'd be intelligence, so we can have more opportunities and more opportunities for good employment, become teachers, and deaf culture, deaf studies have become more and more popular in the last decades, and discussions on deafness and discussions about intelligence and this kind of thing. Deaf gain is kind of a framework on how we do this. So we are able to have intellectual discussions for, you know, like, so we don't say, oh, deaf can't do this. Deaf people can't do this. They're limited, da, 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 da. That's what it was in the past. Oh, sorry, this is a problem. Deaf people can't do this. You know, they're not able to, right? So we've all heard this rhetoric. And then if you show examples, for example, I'll show you an example. For VR in Detroit, there was one man who worked for several years at.
He worked as a tool and die cut maker.
Thank you. Tool and die cut maker, and he needed all this equipment for that to make those things, and
worked in the car industry.
Worked in the car industry, and he was working for many years. After many years, he was laid off. And he was applying for several other jobs, very frustrated. And finally, he was able to get another job at another factory. But they said, no, you can't work as a tool and die maker, because in that particular area where the tool and die workers work, they have overhead vehicle coming, you know, overhead, and they were concerned for his safety. They said, you know, you're deaf, it's not safe, you can't be down there underneath all of that going on above you, because you wouldn't hear it. And it just so happened that one of the tool and die machines broke down one day. And so the deaf man looked at it, went over to it, and the hearing folks were all kind of looking at it. And, you know, the deaf person was able to figure it out. And other people were like, how did you know how to do that? He fixed it. And, you know, so he was like, well, I was a tool and die maker. And he was on the line, I can't think of the word, the assembly line, factory line. And so the reason, you know, they were saying, oh, you can't do this because you can't hear, they were like, the hearing can hear this. They couldn't necessarily hear it either because it was very, very noisy in the factory. And then so they just added a strobe type light. And when the, you know, deaf person is like, it just didn't matter. The hearing thing just didn't matter. They were saying, oh, the deaf couldn't do that. Deaf people couldn't do this. And then they added a light, and then it made it accessible, of course, for the deaf person. And it also benefited the hearing people as well, because of the noise in the factory, they couldn't hear it. So basically, you know, deaf gain uses the opportunity for deaf people, depending on their visual acuity, and people just don't think of that, don't think of the background or the color or whatever. You're sitting all day, and if you're looking at a blurry background or a printed shirt or whatever, your eyes become fatigued, right? So it forces people to think in with different perspectives and help add to things that hearing people have never thought of before. Okay.
Xiaorong saying, thank you. I'm just curious about Deafhood, what that means to you. Can you speak to that from your experience or your opinion? Yes, Deafhood, yes. So there was a deaf man in London. He was a professor in deaf studies there. And he wrote a quite substantial book and had gone around teaching and lecturing. And it was his opinion that deaf people have rapport amongst themselves, unlike that between deaf and hearing individuals. Because of our similar experiences, our similar barriers we've faced, that hearing people lack that experience. So having that kind of rapport and that immediate connection comes naturally to deaf with other deaf people as opposed to deaf with hearing people. Some of those shared experiences and shared upbringing and shared barriers are there. So perhaps you don't share that even with your family. And with the hearing world at large, they don't share those experiences or those barriers. And so deaf people look at each other as having that immediate connection or that immediate rapport. Even with you, Xiaorong, I look as a deaf person, even though you're from somewhere else, that we immediately have that connection. And it's substantial and immediate when you meet another deaf person. So I had a friend from 50 years ago, actually, when we've been friends for 50 years and we still have that connection. It's really hard as a deaf person to break away from that. Avery saying, I have a follow-up question for that. Can you explain a deaf role model or a deaf mentor? What does that mean to you? Well, I think those are two different things. First of all, a deaf role model and a mentor or a deaf mentor are for me, go into two separate buckets. So for myself, personally, people who I look up to, who I admire, would be a role model, people I feel similarly with, or people I identify with. And whether you're deaf or hearing, you should have a role model. But mine just happened to be deaf, one of which is Dr. Andrew Foster. He was the first Black deaf graduate from Gallaudet, and that was 1954. And he decided after graduation to move to Alaska, or I don't know that move is the correct word, but traveled to Alaska. And at that time, they were becoming separate from Europe. And in deaf education and deaf history, they were building deaf schools at that time. And at that time, there were maybe a handful of deaf schools. And Dr. Foster established 31 different deaf schools in 11 different countries. Not only that, he got there and there was no schools. There was nothing to be found. There was no deaf teachers. There was no sign language being used. So he had to work from scratch to build these schools, and he didn't speak the same language as anyone there, but he still was successful. So that to me is someone who I admire and really I look to give me motivation to see that I can really do anything. Now, speaking to a mentor, that to me is more someone who you can throw ideas off of, get feedback from, have a higher level intellectual discussion with, maybe someone who is lecturing or giving presentations, a person who can watch you if you're doing that type of work and help you kind of hone your skill or fine tune your approach to things and help you develop. So when I was becoming a VR counselor, this was someone who I would look to for support, or that could be a VR counselor if you're looking to your career and you're working with someone. So that's the difference for me. And someone who a mentor for me is Dr. Doug Viton. Him and I worked together in Arkansas. And I would ask him questions, Dr. Doug Watson. And I would ask him questions. He would really push me and challenge me. And yeah, so that to me is someone who is a mentor. Avery saying, well, thank you. You know, and both of those individuals were deaf. My role model, my mentor, both of them were deaf. You know, because to me, communication is key. Avery and Xiaorong are saying, yeah, we agree. So I think we have about 10 minutes left before the Q&A. And one thing I'm curious about is many people in the audience here today have received help from a counselor or are in rehab counseling, training to be in the field or in the field. So I'm curious if you have any advice for them on people who are using counselors or who are in the field. I mean, sure, yeah, I've got a lot of advice. I'm gonna have to pick and choose a few nuggets here. Let's see. First, I'd say be flexible with communication. With deaf people specifically, communication, having sign skills, and all of that. I mean, the array of what communication looks like for a deaf person is varied. Perhaps they have limited education, perhaps they have other cognitive or physical disabilities on top of their hearing loss. So there's, and then on the other end of the spectrum can be a deaf individual who has a PhD and is highly educated. So I would say just looking at that spectrum and being aware of it and then being able to be flexible and accommodate that and open to whoever comes in your door, wherever they are in life. So be flexible with communication. Secondly, I would say have respect for the individual. What your body language looks like, how you emote on your face, making sure people know that you're interested in what they're saying. Really, I'm very attuned to how people look at me and how that makes me think about what their opinion is of me and how that can motivate what I'm willing to do. So just facial expressions, body language, your ability to be patient with people. You know, sometimes you have to really get in there and work and go back and forth with someone before you're able to be successful with what you're doing and how you're partnering. So being very patient and making sure that you're having a mutual understanding and getting to the point of being successful rather than being hurried and kind of shuffling people out the door and wanting to get on with your day can sometimes happen. So I live in New York right now, or excuse me, I did live in New York for 10 years. And I worked at a community college there. And there were a variety of different deaf people, deaf immigrants, deaf people that were native to New York and who were born and raised there. And to work with all of them, it required a high level of flexibility. Avery saying, thank you for sharing that. So we just have a few minutes left here. I'm going to look over my questions and look at the time. So I think our last question is, so many people know about deaf culture, ASL, sign language, but I don't know that many people are familiar or know about Black ASL, BASL, or Black deaf culture. So I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to that. Definitely. So in terms of deaf history, the South has a deaf ed history. The South has a very rich history compared to the North. 20 different states had segregated schools for the deaf. Black students and white students did not go to the same school. They did not share the same campus. They were segregated. And even if physically they were perhaps shared the same campus, they would not socialize with each other. So for example, in Arkansas, they had the white deaf school and then they had the Black school, and it was on the same campus, but they were never to mingle or mix. And this is the same with hearing people, but with deaf people, with human nature, they want to communicate, which is the same for anyone, deaf or hearing. So you can't be isolated and you can't communicate in isolation. So the Black students developed some of their own signs and their own culture, and developed as a group in that way. And people weren't aware that was an actual language until actually 2011. And I actually have the book with me that the research was done about that. One moment. And he stepped out of his chair to go grab a book. Here it is, and he's holding up a book that says The Hidden Treasure of Black ASL. So there was a professor at Gallaudet, or actually two professors from Gallaudet. One was from, one has a PhD and one was from California. And the four of them went to the four researchers went to 6 different states and interviewed people, took videos, and found many of the white individuals' signs were different than the Black deaf individuals. And it was because of that specific reason that these schools were segregated and they were separate. So because of that, they identified Black ASL. And so since then, people have been researching it more and finding out more about it and taking videos and learning more. And there is now a center on Black deaf studies at Gallaudet. And so hopefully from there will be more workshops, video logs, research, and I think more people will be learning about BASL because of deaf culture and because of that center and the national awareness of it. So we want to just share the information and have it spread.
Okay, I'll take over. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's very important to know about. Not everyone's educated about that. And Dr. Glenn is saying, yes, I remember many deaf people were involved, in the Black hearing community, but, like picking up the Black English type thing and incorporating that into our sign language. So yeah, the hearing Black culture did influence our signed language and our language. And it is a lot different from mainstream ASL. There's several things that are different in the Black community communication. And so Xiaorong saying, should we go to the Q&A now? Where, in terms of the Q&A questions, in the hearing world and the deaf world.
What is one of the best tools we can use to help connect between the hearing world and the deaf world?
I should pull that up. Okay. What is one of the best tools we can use to help connect between the hearing world and the deaf world?
Dr. Anderson saying, I can't see the Q&A. Can I see those questions too? How do I pull those up?
Oh, Avery's saying, I'll add it to the chat. Okay, Amy put it in.
So the best tools to connect the hearing world and deaf world. I think Gallaudet is a fantastic example. Actually, on their website, they have ASL Connect, which is a free course to learn ASL. And I think that can be of interest to hearing people, you know, and then from there, maybe they'll be interested and take a deeper dive into deaf culture after getting exposure to some of that sign language. And I think the most important part is just making it easy for people to be curious. Seeing that there are captions on TV or captions on videos, seeing different accessibility features for deaf people can make people curious. Oh, and I'm trying to open it on my screen here and it went away. And then the difference between the social and medical model regarding deafness. The medical model to me means it's honestly really focused on what deaf people can't do. Realizing deaf people can't do this, they can't have the same language as hearing people, they can't have X, Y, and Z related to psychology, etc. And then the social model is, to me, looking at it from a cultural perspective, and it's more of a positive outlook, looking at language that deaf individuals use and have throughout history. Sign language is natural to them and to us, focusing on eyes and vision and seeing, whereas the medical model focuses on hearing and ears. Excuse me. So yeah, those are the biggest differences to me.
The next question is, what is the title of the book on Black ASL that you just showed? Can you show that again?
And he's holding it up in front of the screen and it says The Hidden Treasure of Black ASL by Carolyn McCaskill, Seal Lucas, Robert Bailey, and Joseph Hill. And it is a black book with green writing on it.
And Avery's saying, any other questions from the attendees or anything? I'm checking the chat and the Q&A. I don't see any other questions. Paul has a raised hand, Avery. Avery saying, I don't know how to look at that or see that or address that. And Dr. Knopf, do you know how to work with the raised hand?
Yeah. There's a few questions. There's a few questions now in the Q&A. So why don't you go ahead with that? Okay.
Okay. Yes, so I'll look at those. So, oh, you're doing that.
Questions. I have been to China. No, excuse me. I've not been to China. Not yet. No, not yet. I was just looking at the Q&A. Someone asked if I had been to China, and no, unfortunately, I have not. Yeah, I haven't been out of the U.S. since the late 60s. It's been stuck here, unfortunately. I'd love to travel, and I'm curious about, learning what it's like, but yeah, I have not. What is my hope for the future regarding the deaf community? Wow. Well, we have many deaf individuals who are strong leaders, strong advocates, and give their time to support the deaf community, deaf organizations, what have you. But unfortunately, those people are aging. They're not young anymore. Their health is declining. Some of them are past. And young individuals, or those younger generations, are not sharing the passion and values, the leadership, or the give back attitude of that older generation. And some of those older individuals are kind of wanting to kick back and enjoy their free time at this point. And, that continued fight and that continued want to advocate and to lead, I really think we need to focus on that, because I don't want to lose how far we've come. Because if we lose any of that headway or how far we come, it's very hard to get it back. It's easier to keep going on the path that we're on, rather than go back to a place where we were before and try to make strides and make it back there. That can be almost impossible. So I believe that the younger generation needs to step up and become responsible and support our community. And I see, I just think it's important to know that we can't take things for granted, because things can easily be taken away. And then people are stuck asking for things that they had before that that are gone. So I definitely think we need to prioritize. And you can see that right now with VR. VR today does not look as it did 50 years ago. 50 years ago, there were many deaf individuals. And as time went on, it became more spread out, and there's not as many deaf people as there was in the past.
Thank you for sharing that. So we do have another question asking about if you have any words about international development for the deaf community. Like Xiaorong saying, like working on international development in the deaf community. International.
No, I don't have much to say in that regard. I mean, I'd love to have an opportunity to go to South Africa. I'd love to see that area. I'd love to go to China. He's laughing.
Chinese Center. Come to our China Center and do a presentation, Xiaorong saying.
Yeah, I'd love to go to both of those places. Wow, yeah, absolutely. And we had another question pop up here. Sorry.
talking about, as college, how can we as college educators encourage more deaf students to enroll in our programs and colleges? Do you have experience or advice in that regard? That's just, there's a lot going on in the chat and in the Q&A. Yeah, so Xiaorong saying, how can we as colleges or college educators encourage more deaf students to enroll, excuse me, in our programs and colleges? And they're just looking at the different questions in the chat. Kim's question. How can we in the hearing community do more to promote broader use of ASL? Well, there's so many questions.
Dr. Anderson saying, "Ooh, teach advocacy." I look back and no one taught me, speaking to self-advocacy, no one taught me self-advocacy. Being a deaf person in a hearing world and facing that, it just was internalized, or it was internal to me. You know, I didn't, you know, how did I get that? Did my parents teach it to me? I can't identify that. I don't know. I never went to a class or a place to learn self-advocacy. I think it was just a matter of standing up for myself and kind of following my goals. And if I had a goal, not letting other people derail me or put me down. But yeah, I think it was self-taught. I don't know that anyone directly taught me that. Yeah, I think it's important, you know, to know what your goals are and to have that identified.
Thank you so much. That had to be the last question because unfortunately we've run out of time. Shucks. But please join us next week for our conversation about visual impairment and visual loss with, I missed the name, Wally. Same place, same time. Thank you, everyone.
And